China's economy produced $21.27 trillion in 2016, based on purchasing power parity. It's the world's largest economy. The European Union is second, at $19.1 trillion. The United States fell to third place, producing $18.5 trillion. China has 1.37 billion people, more than any other country in the world. China is still a relatively poor country in terms of its standard of living. Its economy only produces $15,400 per person, compared to the U.S. GDP per capita of $57,300. The low standard of living allows companies in China to pay their workers less than American workers. That makes products cheaper, which lures overseas manufacturers to outsource jobs to China. Source: China's Economy, CIA World Factbook. Components of China's economy. China built its economic growth on low-cost exports of machinery and equipment. Massive government spending went into state-owned companies to fuel those exports. These companies dominate their industries. They include the big three energy companies, PetroChina, Sinopec, and China National Offshore Oil Corporation. These state-owned companies are less profitable than private firms. They return only 4.9% on assets compared to 13.2% for private companies. China developed cities around these factories to attract workers. As a result, 1/4 of China's economy is in real estate. The government also funded construction of railways and other infrastructure to support growth. As a result, it imported massive amounts of commodities, like aluminum and copper. By 2013, the 10% annual growth threatened to become a bubble. That's when China looked toward economic reform. China's exports. China was the world's largest exporter from 2013 to 2015. It exported $2 trillion of its production in 2016. The EU took the number 1 spot, exporting $2.26 trillion. The United States came in third at just $1.47 trillion. China shipped 18% of its exports to the United States in 2015. That contributed to a $365 billion trade deficit. China's trade with Hong Kong was almost as much, 14.6%. Its trade with Japan, 6%, and South Korea, 4.5%, was much less. China encouraged trade with African nations, investing in their infrastructure in return for oil. It increased trade agreements with Southeast Asian nations and many Latin American countries. That's why President Obama launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. It doesn't include China. That's because one of its goals was to balance China's growing economic power in the region. That agreement was thrown into jeopardy once President Trump withdrew from it January 2017. China does a lot of manufacturing for foreign businesses, including U.S. companies. They ship raw materials to China. Factory workers build the final products and ship them back to the United States. In this way, a lot of China's so-called exports are technically American products. China primarily exports electrical equipment and other types of machinery. This includes computers and data processing equipment as well as optical and medical equipment. It also exports apparel, fabric and textiles. It's the world's largest exporter of steel. China imports. China is the world's third largest importer. In 2016, it imported $1.4 trillion. The United States imported $2.2 trillion. China imports raw commodities from Latin America and Africa, such as oil and other fuels, metal ores, plastics and organic chemicals. It's the world's largest importer of aluminum and copper. China's commodity consumption has fueled a worldwide boom in mining and agriculture. Unfortunately, suppliers overproduced, creating too much supply. As a result, prices cratered in 2015. As China's growth slows, prices for commodities used in manufacturing, such as metals, will drop. Source: China's Giant Appetite, The Wall Street Journal, August 26, 2015. Why China's growth is slowing. China's economic growth rate slowed to 6.6% in 2016, the lowest since 2009. It grew 6.9% in 2015, 7.3% in 2014, 7.7% in 2013, 7.8% in 2012 and 9.3% in 2011. Before that, China enjoyed 30 years of double-digit growth. Unfortunately, that was fed by government stimulus spending, business investment in capital goods, low interest rates and state protection of strategic industries like banking. This success led to 5.5% inflation in 2011, a real estate asset bubble, growth in public debt and severe pollution. Source: China, Fed Policy Weigh on Investors, The Wall Street Journal, January 19, 2016. The government's emphasis on job creation and exports left little for social welfare programs. That forced the Chinese population to save for their retirement, strangling domestic demand. Most of the growth occurred in the cities along China's east coast. These urban areas attracted 250 million migrant workers. Chinese leaders must continue to create jobs for all these workers or face unrest. They remember Mao's revolution all too well. At the same time, they must provide more social services. That would allow workers to save less and spend more. Only an increase in domestic demand will enable China to become less reliant on exports. In addition, leaders must crack down on local corruption. They must find ways to improve the environmental impact of industrialization. Already leaders have embarked on an ambitious nuclear and alternative energy program to reduce reliance on dirty coal and imported oil. All of these measures are part of China's economic reform. How China affects the U.S. economy. China is the second largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury bills, bonds, and notes. As of April 2017, China owned $1.092 trillion in treasuries. That's 27.9% of the public debt held by foreign countries. For details, see what is the U.S. debt to China? Source: Major foreign holders of U.S. securities, U.S. Treasury. China buys U.S. debt to support the value of the dollar. This is because China pegs its currency, the yuan, to the U.S. dollar. It devalues the currency when needed to keep its export prices competitive. China's role as America's largest banker gives it leverage. For example, China threatens to sell part of its holdings whenever the United States pressures it to raise the yuan's value. Since 2005, China raised the yuan's value by 33% against the dollar. Between 2014 and 2015, the dollar's strength increased by 25%. China allowed the value of the yuan to decline. This was so its exports could remain competitive with Asian countries that hadn't tied their currency to the dollar. For more, see dollar to yuan conversion. How China avoided the recession. During the financial crisis of 2008, China pledged 4 trillion yuan, about $580 billion, to stimulate its economy to avoid the recession. The funds represented 20% of China's annual economic output. It went towards low-rent housing, infrastructure in rural areas, and construction of roads, railways, and airports. China also increased tax deductions for machinery, saving businesses 120 billion yuan. China raised both subsidies and grain prices for farmers, as well as allowances for low-income urban dwellers. It eliminated loan quotas for banks to increase small business lending. But now China's companies are struggling to repay that debt. Combined private-public debt is 2.5 times greater than GDP. Source: Taking a Tumble, The Economist, August 29, 2015. China also took a leadership role by dropping interest rates 3 times in 2 months. Source: China unveils 4 trillion yuan spending as world faces recession. Bloomberg, November 10, 2008. Does China engage in unfair trade practices? In the 2016 presidential campaign, Republican candidate Donald Trump accused China of unfair trade practices. He threatened to slap a 30% tariff on all Chinese imports. China's unfair trade practices were also a hot topic during the 2012 presidential debate. During that debate, President Obama recounted how the U.S. Department of Commerce successfully brought many disputes to the World Trade Organization over unfair practices involving tires, steel and other materials. The WTO has a specific process to resolve trade disputes. These accusations are nothing new. In 2007, the Commerce Department threatened to apply penalty tariffs to Chinese products. For example, it accused China of dumping its paper exports into the United States. The Commerce Department claimed that China unfairly provided subsidies of 10–20% to its manufacturers of glossy paper used in books and magazines. Trade volume had grown 177% in 1 year. The U.S.-based NewPage Corporation brought the anti-dumping case to the Commerce Department. It said it could not compete against subsidized prices. China is the reason Hank Paulson became Treasury Secretary. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson was hired in 2006 to lower the trade deficit with China. He initiated the strategic economic dialogue to open China's market, especially its banking industry. He had several successes. He persuaded Chinese leaders to raise the yuan's value when compared to the dollar 20% between 2005 and 2008. They also eliminated a 17% tax rebate for exporters. They increased the reserve requirement for central banks to 12%. They also invested $3 billion in the U.S. Blackstone Group,